Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I wanted to talk today about goal setting. Now this isn't your usual SMART goals. I want to talk a little bit more about goal setting as it relates to project planning. Something that's annual, it's long-term, it's something that needs to be broken down, whether it's a quarterly project, a monthly project, whether it's something that spans quarters. It may take the whole year, it may not, but it's something that you want to get done in the space of the next year. Now, a couple things you want to remember about goal setting is you want to make sure that you are limiting the amount of work you have in progress. Trying to accomplish too much means you're probably not going to get it done. I'll show you a little bit later the momentum planner I'm using. It only has a limited number of spaces. You have to realize that if it makes it onto that large project list, you're probably not going to have time to do more than 4 or 5 in a quarter or 4 or 5 in a month. If there's something that's really that big and that long term, you want to try and limit those. Because you remember, if you're like me, I have other work I need to get done. It's not just these large projects that I'm working on, it's everything else at the same time. That being said, let me give you a quick overview. How I started working with my annual goals is I started with my job description. Hopefully you have a job description where you work. I mentioned previously in a video that I own my own company, and so I didn't have a job description. My job had kind of morphed. I started off doing small things and my job got bigger and bigger, and then I was supervising more people, so I had to sit down and write one. That may be the way that you need to go as well if you don't have a job description, but most companies will have one for you. It's just up to you to take a look at it and make sure it's still accurate. Now, goal setting might be other than just things that you're working on at work. It might be stuff that you want to accomplish at home or with your family. Those things kind of operate in the same way. We'll talk a little bit about roles, whether it's business related or home related, and how that wraps into everything. So I'm going to turn the camera around and we'll take a look at how I started working through all of this. I'll show you kind of what my job description looks like when I wrote it, how I made it more useful to me on an ongoing basis, and then how I started using that to brainstorm what I wanted to get accomplished next year. I'll see you in just a moment. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about the job description that I wrote. This is it. It's actually a total of 4 pages, and I wanted to show you a little bit about how it's laid out and how I used that. So the first page is more about what I do, basic functions, desired qualifications. That's not really too important for what I wanted to talk about today. These next sections are. What I did is when I wrote this, I broke it down into different sections. So these are essentially the roles and the things that I'm responsible for as CFO of our company. So the first section is planning, the second section is operations, third section is financial information, and on the back we have risk management, funding, and third parties. So these are the general areas that I'm responsible for. So inside of planning, this is kind of more of a strategic planning section. Things like providing leadership and development of short and long-term strategic financial objectives, working with the president on strategic vision, participating in developing new business, providing an operating budget. Granted, I understand all of this. I know it because this is what I do every single day. But to be perfectly honest with you, every time I sat down to read this and try and figure out, okay, how do I use this for goal setting? All my brain thought was blah, blah, blah. Because after a while, it gets to be a lot of jargon. I understand the jargon, but it's not helpful to me when I'm trying to use it. So I actually took this and made it usable. Now, mind you, I'm not really one for mind maps, but I really actually needed to do this in order to be able to distill down what it is that I'm doing. So in the middle here is my job title, and then this first spoke out is all of the subject heads from my job description. So if you look, we first have planning, and you come over here, I labeled it strategic planning. And underneath that, each one of those numbered items is a bubble attached to it. I pulled all of these different subject heads in general areas and made it more into a mind map. So when I do my goal setting using my job description, this is actually what I'm using. The job description, I don't really need anymore. This is what I use. So with that, this probably looks very familiar because I showed this to you when I was doing a flip through of my goal setting momentum planner, all those different sections. So this is where I took each one of these areas and made it a section here on my brainstorming sheet. So this is really messy, I will admit it, but that's because I'm brainstorming. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do, what quarter I want to do things in. Things have already moved around. This stuff has actually been promoted up to being more important than I initially thought it was. So like I said, this is a scratch piece of paper here. So the first thing I did is I wrote down all the different sections, and then I looked through every single thing that was attached to fiscal function and performance. Did any of these things here trigger an idea for a project that I needed to work on? This is how I sat down and started goal setting. One of the things on here is budget analysis and creating budgets. That was the first thing I thought of. I need to create a 2018 budget and enter it into our accounting system. Along with that, I actually also need to make an appointment for tax advising. But if you notice next to these, after I brainstormed, I made a note. This is more of a monthly type of project. Making a tax appointment, it's going to take a day, maybe two if I'm waiting for her to call me back. So that's not more of a long-term project. But initially when I'm writing these things down, I'm not determining if it's long-term or not. This is just getting these things out of my head so that I don't forget about them, and then I can figure out where they need to fit in. You'll see here under administrative functions, I have that I am converting forms to Google Forms, looking into an FSA, which is a flexible spending account. And then you'll notice here that I've made notes. Some of these are conversations and decisions I can't make on my own. These are things that need to happen during our strategic planning meeting. So I've gone through afterwards and made notes about that as well. I actually do have a strat planning section here where I had written some of these down, and I had to go back in and make a note that some of these things need to be discussed here as well. In addition to my job description, I also pulled information from the industry areas that I'm involved in. So there are some things that I wasn't sure whether I was going to be involved in or not. Some of this has actually finally been decided. I think I mentioned that in my last video as well. But in the meantime, I know that I've applied for something, and to keep that in mind. Once I've brainstormed everything, the next thing I need to do is figure out when it is that I'm going to be working on these. First thing I need to consider is what major events do I have coming up next year. So I actually wrote things down. You'll notice they're not in order. It's just as things came to mind. When I have things that are due, when I'm going to be traveling, if I have things that are a day or two that may not be a lot on their own, but if I have 4 or 5 of them in a month, they might add up. So that's all information I have to keep in mind when I'm trying to figure out when I'm going to work on stuff. Other things to consider, some of this might already have a time frame. I know that I need to create the 2018 budget before 2018. That obviously means I have to have it done by Q4 of this year. There are other things that don't really have a timeline. Sometimes that timeline may change when something comes up, but for the most part, you can start to assign things to quarters. And based on what's left over as far as space, then you can fill in the rest with the things that are left. Something else to keep in mind, if your work is very cyclical like mine is, I know there are certain times of the year that it is not a good idea for me to start a whole brand new project. For example, January, being in the accounting field, that's when I'm doing all of the tax planning. I'm trying to get financials ready for our owners. That's not a good time for me to take on a giant project. Summer is also not a good time. That's when we have a lot of people moving out. Kids are out of school. College students are out of college. That's when people are starting to move. About that time of the year is when we're doing a lot of our move-ins and move-outs, so I don't want to try and start anything during that time. That's also generally when we do a lot of our lease renewals. So I know that I need to reserve like May to July and just not start anything new. Once you kind of know when things need to be done, you'll see I had written in here 17 Q4, 17 Q3. I have an 18 with a question mark next to Q2. I started trying to figure out like what quarter do I need to be working on some of this in. But the next thing I needed to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, how big of a project is this? Making a tax advising appointment, that's a day or two. Making financial dashboards, that probably would take me a month, maybe less. Reviewing accounting team assignments and portfolio structure, again, that's maybe a month, probably more like a week. I probably won't have many changes, and so it won't take me that long to do. In fact, most of my projects on here are actually more month-long projects. I would say, even though I have a month next to convert forms to Google Forms, that actually is more of a quarterly type project because as I convert things, I keep finding new forms that we're using that need to be done. So that is kind of expanded a little bit, which is fine because I can work on a form at a time because each one of those maybe takes me 3 or 4 hours at the most, including doing some of the heavier duty programming. Take a hard look at what you actually have and figure out how long is it going to take you. The other one that's more of a quarterly project is reviewing and revising all of our manuals for our employees. That's going to be a lot of reading, a lot of editing. There may be some research on what the laws are to see if anything actually needs to be updated. So that is more of a quarterly project. The other thing to consider that might be more of a quarterly project is anything that requires training. If you are working with other people on something, because a lot of times waiting for them to do their part, seeing if you need to follow up, sometimes that may stretch a project out before you can say, yes, it's done, we can move on. Earlier I mentioned using the same principle to set goals for your house and for your family. So I wanted to show you what I did on the back as well. So on the back here I have some house goals. These are projects that I want to work on, things that we need to do around the house. I also have some personal goals as well. These are things that I had written down for quite a while. You noticed I scratched through some of them these are things I don't necessarily want to tackle for next year. Another way you might break these down is by roles. So perhaps you have one for yourself as a spouse, yourself as a child, yourself as a parent. Maybe if you do a lot of community work, you might have something for that. So there's several different ways to break down personal goals, but again, using that checklist of roles that you have, or breaking it down house versus personal, you might consider your health, maybe some spiritual goals. All of those things, you can use a similar idea to this. Maybe they don't have all the extended items, but you have all of these initial roles that you can use to then set goals for yourself and for your house and for your family. Hopefully that gave you some ideas about how to use your job description for more than just doing your annual review and seeing how you're doing. Using your job description for goal setting, I think, is actually somewhat of a novel idea. And when those performance reviews come around and you have to come up with goals for the next year, this will actually make it a little bit easier instead of trying to just think of 3 goals that you want to do. This gives you some direction and some things to work on, and it kind of acts as a checklist. Looking at each one of these, how am I doing in this area? Do I need to work on anything? Do I need to make it more efficient? Answering each one of those questions will help you come up with goals that you may need to work on for the next year. I hope you found this useful. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I hope you'll subscribe because I have more videos coming up on functional planning, including talking about how I do weekly, monthly, and quarterly reviews, and also talking about working with the momentum planner and breaking down some of these goals and putting them in. So I will do an annual quarterly plan with me so you can see how all of this works in to the annual momentum planner page here. Thank you for watching. See you again soon.